So my name's Caroline Drucker, and I'm joining you today from Cary, North Carolina, which is in the Raleigh-Durham area. And it's currently over 90 degrees, so I hope you're a little more comfortable where you are. And I was asked to speak about my career path and what brought me to where I am in my career, why I'm excited about it, what that career is, and a little bit about how I find balance in my work and my life. So I guess I want to start by going back to my high school years, because that's where you all are now. And in high school, my main interest was in math. And I did a lot of math competitions. I was in the math team that met on the weekends. I took advanced math classes, and even starting in the summer of 2003, before I started high school, I went to the Canada-USA math camp over the summer. In the summers of 2004 and 2005, I went to the program in math for young scientists at Boston University. And in the summer of 2006, I went to the Research Science Institute at MIT. So that's my connection to the Center for Excellence in Education. And at RSI, my project was in math. And this is a picture of all of the RSI 2006 participants. And I did manage to pick my 17-year-old self out of this photo. So I thought that might be a little bit fun. I've gotten a message that you're seeing my whole presenter view. So let me see if I can swap that.
There we go.
I hope that worked, yes. All right. So again, main interest in high school was math. I definitely thought of myself as a math girl. But also, I had always loved reading. I liked language. I really enjoyed my literature classes, my French class. I took a little bit of Latin in high school. I was into public speaking. I was actually captain of my high school's debate team. And I really enjoyed all of my classes in chemistry, physics, and biology. And my junior year, I did a chemistry science fair project. My senior year, I got to take an AP psychology class. As part of that class, I actually, over winter break, and maybe some of you can relate to this, I spent my winter break reading the entire textbook for my AP psychology class. And so in the latter part of that year, I ended up designing and conducting my own study, which was based on something called the Einstellung effect. There are some images at the bottom of the screen, but in the interest of time, I won't go into all of the details of that effect and the study that I did, but that was another science fair project that I did. And then in the summer of 2007, I attended the International Summer Science Institute at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. And that was a really cool program. They brought in students from all over the world who excelled in math and science to work with researchers at Weizmann. And I worked on a microscopy project where we were looking at different kinds of crystal structures. So while math was kind of the main focus, I had a lot of other interests all throughout high school. So I ended up going to college at Yale, and there I initially dove into math in a big way. I took multiple math classes for my first semester, and I volunteered with an organization called Math Counts Outreach, where I coached middle school math teams in the New Haven area, and I even graded papers as a little part-time job in college for other math classes. But I also, since I loved my psychology class in high school, I took a cognitive science class my freshman year of college. And there was one speaker, her name was Lori Santos, who came and gave a guest lecture in that class. And I just found her talk really compelling. She seemed like someone I would really get along with. So I approached her about whether there were any positions in her lab. And I was able to start helping with research in her comparative cognition lab starting in my freshman year. And in that lab, we studied capuchin monkeys, which are these guys in the upper right corner. And she had trained them on a whole token economy. So the capuchin monkeys in our lab were able to recognize that these little tokens that we gave them had value and could be traded for super special treats like grapes. And we looked at all sorts of economic decision-making that these capuchin monkeys did when presented with these tokens. And that helps give some perspective on the evolutionary basis of human decision-making when it comes to economics. So alongside working in that lab, I became interested in the biological basis for our behavior and cognition. So that was pushing me towards courses in animal behavior, but also in neuroscience to kind of get at the more brain basis of our psychology. So as part of my animal behavior studies, I ended up working in a lab where I conducted my own study on this butterfly here. It's the Bicyclus aninana butterfly. And that took some dedication. These butterflies are active only at dawn and at dusk. So dusk wasn't an option based on my schedule in college. And so 3 times a week, my junior year, I woke up before sunrise and walked up Science Hill in New Haven so I could get to the lab to see these butterflies when they were active at dawn. But it was really rewarding to be running essentially my own study. And I was working with a graduate student. We ended up publishing that study as a paper. So that was pretty cool to get my name on a paper as an undergraduate. And the summer before my senior year of college, I was supposed to go to Puerto Rico for the full summer to do field research with rhesus monkeys. So these guys here are rhesus monkeys, and they are on the island of Cayo Santiago off the coast of Puerto Rico. And this is an island that is full of free-ranging rhesus monkeys and a few other animals and giant lizards and other things. And it is closed to humans except for a very small group of researchers associated with the University of Puerto Rico who have a partnership with Yale and Duke and a couple other places. So unfortunately, there was a sickness going around the island that summer. So I ended up spending the first couple months of that summer actually at Duke. I had connected with some professors down here, and they were doing research on cognition in dogs and lemurs. And that sounded super fun to me. So I came down to Duke for the summer. I got a grant through some research office at Yale. And I did cognition research with these other species, which was a lot of fun. Fell in love with Duke, met some really great people. And I did still get to go to Puerto Rico for, I think, about 3 weeks at the end of the summer to collect some data on the rhesus monkeys for my senior thesis. So through that time at Yale, I was really, while I still liked math and I ended up double majoring in math and psychology, my research interests were really pushing more in the kind of biology and psychology direction. So because I had had such a great experience at Duke the summer before my senior year, I decided to go straight to graduate school after undergrad and ended up getting into Duke as my first choice. And they had a program in cognitive neuroscience where you got to do rotations in different labs in your first year. And then you joined a lab officially and affiliated with a department. So I ended up in a PhD program in neurobiology. And what I was studying kind of pulled together a lot of what I had done and been interested in before. I was looking primarily at the evolutionary and neural bases of numerical cognition and decision-making. So when we're doing math and thinking about numbers, what is going on in our brains? And also, what can we learn from looking at our evolutionary ancestors and what their abilities are in these domains? So this is just kind of a fun picture here showing the area of the brain that we think is responsible for numerical cognition. In monkeys, this is a rhesus monkey brain diagram. It's in their posterior parietal cortex here, and the corresponding area in adults, specifically the intraparietal sulcus. So if any of you, I don't know how deep the biology you're studying goes into brain anatomy, but that intraparietal sulcus is really where we think math is happening in the brain. So it's kind of cool to see that conserved from young children to adults and humans, but then also back to monkeys. So that kind of pulled in my interest in math, and the type of research I was doing required me to learn programming in MATLAB. So we were presenting tasks to the animals on touch screens. So I had to program the presentation of those tasks and also the recording of the data that we were getting from those experiments. It all got done in MATLAB. And then I also did my statistical analysis in MATLAB. So I was really glad to have a strong quantitative background for that kind of research. Another part of my dissertation project that was sort of, I ended up drawing together some of the studies, but it seems a little unrelated. But there were folks in my lab who were collaborating with some of the biomedical engineers at Duke to study the neuronal mechanisms behind transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment, which is used currently for treating depression, schizophrenia, and I'm not sure if it's been approved for anything else yet, but it was being studied for all sorts of brain-based disorders. And so I was looking a little bit at, what's actually going on in the brain when we apply this treatment, which involves putting an electromagnetic coil next to someone's head. So it sounds a little bit like voodoo science, but it seems to actually work. And so we were trying to figure out why it works, what's actually happening in the brain. And I was finding that this connection to human health and human conditions was really keeping me engaged. I was excited about studying numerical cognition and working with monkeys. That was all very interesting to me. But what actually got me more motivated was this connection to human patients. Now, alongside my graduate research, I was finding that, the bench work was okay, but more than the bench work, what I really liked was reading, writing, and speaking about the science experiments that I was doing or that other people were doing. And my interest here actually does go back to college a little bit. So my senior year of college, as kind of a whim, my senior year, I was able to take a class on a pass-fail basis, and I ended up taking a class with the science writer Carl Zimmer, who was teaching sort of an introductory course on science journalism. So Carl Zimmer has written a number of popular science books, and he writes frequently for the New York Times and other outlets on all sorts of different scientific topics. I was very glad I took that class pass-fail. My first paper did not go over very well. Subsequent papers, I got better, and it was a really fantastic learning opportunity, and I really enjoyed the kind of writing that I did there. So in grad school, I continued to take advantage of any and all opportunities to enhance my science communication skills. So of course, as part of my graduate program, I wrote and published and also reviewed scientific manuscripts. And I wrote a couple of grant applications, but I also participated in programs like ComSciCon, the Communicating Science Conference, in the Triangle region of North Carolina. There was a program at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences where we worked on how to communicate in a museum environment. We designed some hands-on science activities for kids to do in the museum. I gave a talk at that museum. I gave talks to other student groups in the area. There was a workshop at Duke on different kinds of media that I participated in. And so alongside that, I was also starting to try to get some of my own writing out there. I wrote a couple of pieces for the Duke Research blog on research studies that colleagues of mine were doing that I just thought were really interesting and would be exciting to the general public. And I also ended up submitting an article to Natural History magazine. I had a former colleague from Duke who went on to do a postdoc at a lab in England studying killer whales. And they were actually finding out some really interesting things about adult female killer whales who actually survive past their reproductive years. And this is very unusual. It happens in humans, obviously, but it doesn't happen in many other species. So they were looking at what the function of this might be evolutionarily for these whales. And they were finding that these older female killer whales were the ones often leading their family groups toward some of the best places to feed and some of the safest places in the water to be. And they had some really clear quantitative findings about this. So I submitted an article about that to Natural History magazine and connected with the president of the magazine. It's a small operation, and he actually lives down here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And he took a liking to me. I guess he saw something in me, and asked, they published my article, and he asked if I would be interested in becoming an editor for them. So I continued doing some writing and editing for Natural History for the next few years. And that was alongside my work in graduate school. So once I finished my PhD in the spring of 2016, I did continue as a postdoc through that summer to finish up some of my research. But I was really, trying to move more toward the science communication direction. And I connected with some folks in the Center for Human Disease Modeling at Duke, which was studying rare genetic disorders and trying to model them primarily using zebrafish. As some of you might know, the zebrafish is translucent, so it makes for a really nice biological model. They kind of created a position for me as, they called me their research project manager and communications coordinator. It was a really big group of researchers, and they needed help with things like writing manuscripts and putting together presentations, grant proposals, things like that. So that was very interesting, but it still was a little too close to basic science for my liking. And frankly, I also wasn't sure career-wise where it was going. So even while I was working there, I was still kind of trying to network and put out feelers. And I was very open with my friends and the people I had known from the neuroscience departments at Duke about my interests in science communication and kind of wanting to move probably toward industry and toward the pharmaceutical industry, so that I would kind of have that closer connection to sort of the end goal of helping human health. And I emphasize that I told people about these interests because I think that can be really key. If people don't know what you're interested in and what you're looking for, you could miss out on some kind of fortuitous opportunities. So I ended up hearing about different openings because I had a friend who knew I was looking for something like medical writing, and they were able to connect me with the right person. So I ended up doing a lot of informational interviews to learn about different career options. So that's when you sit down with somebody who's in a certain position and you just kind of pick their brain about what that position is, what they like about it, what they don't like, and what an employer might be looking for in a candidate in that position. So through some of these avenues, I kind of honed in on medical writing, and in a minute I'll go into a little more detail about what that is. But I connected with a company called Impact Pharmaceutical Services in early 2017, and I ended up taking a position there as a regulatory medical writer, which we call it clinical research scientist. And I'll go into why we call it that in a few minutes. So what is a medical writer? Well, medical writing falls into this broad field of science communication that I've been talking about, where, in science communication in general, you're looking to educate an audience about a wide range of scientific topics. So then a medical writer falls underneath that big umbrella, and that's someone who articulates complex medical information or data and really distills it down to the key messages. What are the big headline ideas we want to get from it? And there are two main types of medical writers. One of them is educational medical writing, where you're looking to educate someone, whether that's a health professional or the general public, and teach them about either a certain disease or maybe your company's drug or other kind of product that you want to get the word out about. But then there's also regulatory medical writing. And this is where you are writing for regulators like the FDA or the European equivalent, the EMA. And the goal there is to obtain marketing approval for a company's product. So what does a regulatory medical writer do? each day? Well, in my space, we write, of course, we write a variety of document types. So working in the pharmaceutical space, any product that you're developing, as you all know, has to go through a number of clinical trials. So those clinical trials all require a pretty extensive clinical study protocol. And then once they're done, they require a clinical study report. And this report, you can sort of think of it as the equivalent of like writing a paper at the end of an experiment, except instead of maybe 10 pages that you would write for a journal, these reports can be anywhere from 150 to, I've seen 400 pages for a clinical study report. It's really very extensive analysis and detail about what happened in that clinical trial. We write things like investigational new drug applications. So before a company can even start testing its product in humans, there's a lot of information you need to submit to the FDA to convince them that this is a good idea. And then then you would submit your investigational new drug application, and then you would run all of your studies. And if they're all successful, at the end, you would submit a marketing application, which is when you want to actually start advertising and selling your product. And just for everyone's reference, an emergency use authorization, which you might all be familiar with at this point, that's a type of marketing application. So that's something that my company has worked on. You might write briefing packages for interactions with the FDA. You might write something called an investigator's brochure. Again, brochure, not a little threefold thing. These are about 100 pages long, and it's a compendium of all of the key things that are known about a product up to that point. And it's a reference for the investigators, basically the doctors who are helping to run the clinical trial. So that's just a sampling of the kind of documents that we write. One of my favorite parts of the job is data interpretation. So when we're writing something like a clinical study report, there is a statistician who does all the analysis, but there are tons and tons of analyses. The outputs of those analyses can be thousands of pages long. And we as medical writers need to look through all that data and figure out what the story is that we're trying to tell in our report or in our marketing application. So that, I think, really relies on having a good quantitative background to be able to make sense of all of that data. We also do a lot of project management, especially so in my position, and I'll get into the different kinds of companies in a minute, but we actually get hired by all different pharmaceutical and biotech companies, and those are called the sponsors of clinical trials. So we have to manage communication with the different companies that we're working with. We're all usually working on multiple different documents, and things in this industry change all the time. There can be late-breaking information based on something that happened in a study, based on something that happened in the industry. Maybe there's a competitor's product that just got approved, and that changes our whole strategy. So we're constantly kind of taking in all of this information, reassessing our priorities. And in industry, timelines are key. Everybody always needs to know when it can get done, because that has an impact on the company's finances, because everything we do is working toward the goal of getting a product to market. So everyone wants everything done more quickly, but we have to stick to our guns and say, this is how long we need to get you a quality document. But we're always preparing and revising those timelines. One of the other things that we do is we perform quality control reviews. So every document that we submit to the FDA, we want to make sure is fully accurate. So we don't just have one person write it and then go. We have another person check every single data point and every single sentence in that document. We'll also have discussions with the sponsored team members, like the statistician or a lead clinician on the study, about what a certain result means. And this is where, we really put our scientist hats back on, and we're not just scribes kind of writing down what we're told. We're really diving into the data and thinking about it and thinking about what these results mean in the context of the study and in the context of the disease we're trying to treat more broadly. We also just have to interact again with those sponsor team members. They get to review the documents before they get sent to FDA, and they are busy, busy people. So sometimes we need to very politely remind them that they need to provide their feedback on these documents if we're going to stick to the timeline. And then we have meetings where we discuss their comments on these documents and come to agreement on a way forward. And there's much more that we might end up doing on a day-to-day basis. And this will vary based on someone's position and the needs of a particular project. So right now, I'm in management at my company. So I spend roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of my time still on project work, these kind of documents that we're writing for our clients. But I also spend about 1/4 or 1/3 of my time on management activities, whether that's meeting with my direct reports or meeting with the other managers on my company to kind of make decisions about the direction of the company or decide on different kinds of issues. So a little bit about the skills that would make a good regulatory medical writer. So these handful of slides about medical writing were developed by my company. So this was a colleague of mine who made this nice Venn diagram. So we think about 3 categories of skills for regulatory medical writing. You have your knowledge-based skills. So this is the scientific background comes into play in a big way to understand the study design, the scientific method, a little bit about the drug and its mechanism of action, the effects it might be having on the body. Regulatory knowledge comes into play. So that is an understanding of the rules that the FDA has in place for pharmaceutical and biotech companies and making sure that when we're writing these documents, we're keeping those regulations in mind. And we also need to have a lot of comfort with statistical analysis so that we can understand how the data are being analyzed and what that means. And then you have the technical skills, so that, of course, we need to have good writing ability. You need to be able to put forth a clear message, have good structure and content in your document. You need to write with good grammar and language, and you need to be following kind of the expectations of regulatory writing. There is an art to clear and accurate and persuasive messaging, but we are not looking to write artfully. We are not trying to put out beautiful language. We're trying to put out clear language. And another technical skill, proficiency at Microsoft Word. You might all think that's easy. I know how to use it. I open up Word, I start typing, I press save, I press print. Yes, and that got me pretty far through, college, grad school, even working for a magazine. But it turns out there's a lot more to Microsoft Word than that, and you get really good at it very quickly when you're doing regulatory medical writing, because these are huge documents and they need to be formatted very precisely. And then there are also project management skills that I touched on earlier a little bit. And then finally, there's what are sometimes called soft skills. I don't like this term because I think that they are equally as important as the knowledge-based and the technical skills. And I don't think there's anything soft about them. But these are like your people skills. So your ability to work with other people, which we do all the time. Your attention to detail, your organizational skills, which is really important when you're juggling multiple projects and when there's a lot of information that you're trying to include in each project. And we have to be very flexible and manage our time well. As I mentioned earlier, there are always shifting timelines and shifting priorities. And one thing I do want to highlight here is good judgment. I think, in a lot of people have an impression of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry of, just being out to make a profit. And that may be true to some extent, but I think at the company I work for as medical writers, we pride ourselves on our integrity and making sure that every sentence we put in a document is truly backed up by the data. And so if there's ever a time where, somebody at the client company wants us to say something in a document that we don't feel is supported, we will speak up and say something about that and try to argue for what we think is right there. In terms of the types of organizations that medical writers work for, they could, of course, work within a pharmaceutical or biotech company. And there they would really be involved with maybe one product or maybe 2 or 3 products and help to drive the development of that product through its whole life cycle. And that could be at a big company or a small company, and there are some pros and cons to each of those. Where I work is a contract research organization, and that's where your company gets contracted to help with clinical research. And so this happens because in some cases, pharmaceutical and biotech companies just don't have any in-house medical writers. Sometimes they do, but the volume of work at a given time is too much for their in-house writers to take. So they'll contract it out to a company like mine. And so in this situation, generally the sponsor company, the pharmaceutical company, is ultimately in charge of, the general timeline, and they get final say on what goes into a document. But as I said, we tend to have a lot of influence in that direction. What I think is really cool about working for a CRO, a contract research organization, is that we get to work on a diverse array of different projects. So, because of the nature of the companies that are hiring us, I work not just across multiple different clients, but across different therapeutic areas. So, from month to month, I might be going from a respiratory disorder to a gastrointestinal disorder to a skin disorder to a brain disorder. So I feel like I'm constantly learning there. And there are also all sorts of different kinds of drugs and biological products. So I'm learning about those and how they work in the body. And I'm learning about all different phases of drug development. So that helps to keep me interested from month to month in my job. And there are also, large and small CROs, and some, pros and cons to those as well, in terms of kind of how at a larger company, they tend to have a more defined role for each person. You tend to have to specialize a little bit more. You might become a specialist in phase 2 pulmonary studies, whereas at a smaller company, like I was saying, you get to sort of sample around a little bit more. But it can also be a little more fast-paced and a little more, a lot going on at all times. And then there are various other kinds of companies. There are medical communication companies that help with promotion and advertising, and also with writing journal publications or scientific poster presentations. There are educational training companies, and there are various government-related organizations, like the National Institute of Health. And these kinds of places also hire medical writers. I did want to take a minute to just kind of open your eyes to other positions that maybe some of you know about these already, but I know certainly when I was in high school, I knew nothing about the pharmaceutical or biotech industry. I did not know what anyone did who worked there. So even if you're not someone who's interested in science communication or medical writing, there are all sorts of positions in this industry that might be of interest to you. Of course, you could be a bench scientist working in research and development. So kind of figuring out, trying to kind of put together different compounds and figure out if they might do something in a dish that could potentially translate into humans. There are people who work in what's called chemistry manufacturing and controls. So these are the people responsible for, once we've landed on the compound that we want to pursue, how are we actually going to produce it at scale? And how are we going to ensure or control the quality of that product while we're producing it? So there are people who work on that and consult with that. There are clinical pharmacologists who are looking at the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of drugs. So, the way to think about that is how the drug affects the body and how the body affects the drug. Basically, how does it get absorbed, distributed, and excreted from the body? So that's kind of a cool combination of biology and mathematical modeling, from what I understand. There are people who lead the clinical studies or project manage them. There's usually a medical lead for a product and a study physician. Of course, we need biostatisticians to help analyze all of the data from clinical studies. There are people who look at health economics. How are people who take a given drug using our health system? Are they having fewer ER visits? Are they having fewer doctor's appointments? Are they missing fewer days of work or school? So there are people who kind of focus in on that aspect. There are regulatory affairs leads who are responsible for staying up to date and really knowing backwards and forwards all of the FDA rules and regulations so that they can advise their company and make sure that they're sticking to the straight and narrow in terms of what the FDA is expecting to see. There are people at these companies who luckily are looking out for patient safety. So they're keeping an eye on these clinical trials and raising a red flag if they see something happening, some kind of side effect that's very concerning, or more side effects happening in your drug group versus your placebo group. There are people who work on clinical operations, making sure these trials are running smoothly and all the different products and materials are getting where they need to go. All the data is getting collected properly. Of course, there are people who work in marketing and sales, and there's much more. So this is just to kind of give you a sense of the different kinds of positions, but by no means an exhaustive list. So in terms of me and my career ladder, at least up to this point, so as I mentioned, I started working for this company Impact in 2017. And I started initially as what they call a clinical research scientist 1. So again, that's our term for medical writer, but we think of ourselves as really engaging with the science and helping to kind of get our clients on the right path in terms of their interpretation of their data and the direction that they want to go with their studies and their marketing applications. So started as a level 1, straight out of my academic work, and then went up to level 2 in 2018. And then in 2019, it wasn't an official position in terms of my title at the company, but I took over as the portfolio manager for our largest client. And that has been a really fascinating experience so far. I've learned a lot about the business side of things and have really honed some of my leadership skills in terms of basically every medical writer at my company touches a project that this client has sent us at some point. So I need to keep everybody at my company kind of aligned on what our processes are for this client and what they're expecting of us, while at the same time kind of managing the requests and expectations from the client side, and also working a little bit on contracts behind the scenes. So that's been really cool. And then in 2020, at the beginning of the year, I got promoted to senior clinical research scientist. And that I thought was super exciting because I was getting moved out of, with this promotion to senior, I was getting moved out of my office kind of in the center of the center hallway of our office here. I was getting this nice, beautiful window office. And I moved into that beautiful window office the first week of March 2020. And about a week later, I was told, please don't come into the office. So since then, we've been primarily working remotely, which has actually, worked out pretty well. Certainly didn't slow us down at all. And in late 2020, a management position opened up and everyone internal was invited to apply. And I ended up becoming a manager within my company in late 2020. And that was another just kind of steep learning curve, but just really great to learn about how you motivate people, how you help to develop your direct reports, keep them engaged with the work that they're doing, and also kind of keep everyone aligned with the overall mission of the company. So that's been a really cool experience, and that's the position that I'm still in now. So thinking about what's next, well, as of early this year, my little company, so I didn't mention earlier, I think I left it out, but Impact is a small company based here in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. We were at a little under 50 people, primarily medical writers, some people consulting on regulatory affairs. So we were acquired by a company called the Synergy Biopharma Group, based up near Boston. And they're also, fairly small as these things go. They're about 120 people, and they do completely non-overlapping work. Earlier, I mentioned chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. That's what they focus on. So that kind of just happened earlier this year. So far, we've been told, keep going, status quo, but, things are going to change. So I don't really know what's next for me, either within this organization or if I want to make a move elsewhere. I think being part of a larger organization like this should mean that there are more opportunities that open up. Mergers and acquisitions are actually very common in industry. So it's just one of those things where you always have to be ready for the next change to come along. You might feel very stable and comfortable where you are, and you just have to be ready for something to shake it up. So with that said, the last thing I wanted to touch on was how I find balance in my life. And I think that's not so hard for me right now. The position I'm in it's a full-time position, and it's supposed to be about 40 hours a week. As I mentioned, since the start of the pandemic, we are almost fully remote, so I don't have any kind of commute. And my company allows us for a very flexible schedule. Basically, aside from scheduled meetings that are on the calendar and that I need to be at to talk to people at a particular time, I can work any hours of the day and any days of the week that I want to. So yeah, completely flexible. And my company even gives us 4 hours per month for volunteer work that we can do on company time. And that's, I think, something kind of unique about us. And I really appreciate that commitment to community service that we have. So the flexibility is great. The downside is that it does mean that, it just makes it more important to create your boundaries. And for me, that means kind of drawing lines for the start and end of my workday and taking some true days off, whether that's the weekend or otherwise. And this was something that I did not necessarily do when I was in academia. I think people certainly can, but that hadn't been my approach previously. I did just a lot of round the clock. If I wasn't in the lab, I was reading papers, reviewing papers, analyzing data, working on stuff for natural history. So I was kind of always working in graduate school. And then once I started this job at Impact, when we were primarily in the office, it was a little bit easier to just have that mentality of, okay, going to work, staying there for 8 hours and leaving work. But now with working from home, I need to draw those lines for myself. So one way that I have found to do this that generally works well for me is I like to get up and exercise first thing in the morning. And that's kind of some time for me at the start of the day. Then I'll work for my 8 hours. And then at the end of the day, I like to take this cute little guy up here for a walk. And that helps me to sort of separate my work day from the rest of my evening. That said, I don't always achieve this perfectly. And certainly sometimes my work bleeds into the evenings or the weekends. Sometimes I try to plan vacations and then work sneaks into them. So this is still a little bit of a work in progress, but it's something I'm aware of and getting better at. But I think, living down here in North Carolina, there are a lot of great ways to spend my time outside of working hours and away from my desk, my computer. We have just a lot of great trails and natural places around here. So I like to run, I like to bike. This is a picture I took when I was, I think, biking along a trail by a lake that's just a couple miles from my house here. And it looks like this on a regular basis. There are several places like this around. We have, I really enjoy live theater, musical theater. We have the Durham Performing Arts Center that the traveling Broadway shows come through. So we like to go there. Here in Cary, we have the Coca Booth Amphitheater, which does outdoor concerts in the summer. And then in the winter, they have this Chinese Lantern Festival. So that's this middle picture here. This is just one small sample of the displays that they put up. But that's a really amazing festival that they do every winter. And I think people from all over the state and beyond come to see that here. I like to run. This is a picture from a half marathon last fall in Raleigh. And there's certainly plenty of that in this area. So I think, a lot of ways to kind of use my time away from my computer. So with that all said, I will close that up and thank you all for listening. And I will open this up to any questions you might have.
I was wondering, what are some of the greatest misconceptions that people have about medical writing? And what is kind of the truth behind the career?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably one of the biggest misconceptions is that we're basically glorified secretaries, that, the smart people at the pharmaceutical company come up with great ideas and they talk and we listen and we write it down. And as I hope I talked through a little bit, we really do a lot more than that in terms of, thinking through study design, thinking through how we want to interpret data and put together messages in a study report or a marketing application. And, everyone at these companies is really, really busy, and they have a lot of competing priorities. So we need to do a lot of kind of like herding cats a little bit, but also guiding people to getting us the information that we need, or kind of leading the group to a consensus decision. So there are a lot of kind of group dynamic skills that come into play when you're working with these large teams of people who may not be giving you their full attention, and may all have a different idea of the best way to do things. So kind of helping to mediate all of that and find a path forward, because ultimately the document is the thing that the FDA sees. Like, you might think that, oh, that's just, all of the work is done. Like, we have the product, we've done the trials, we have the data. So, the document is just this little thing at the end that needs to get written. But that is what the FDA is basing their decisions on. So kind of making sure that everyone is clear and aligned on what the messages are that we're putting in that document is really important. So I think, we're not just kind of sitting there listening and typing and, writing down what other people say. We're really having a much heavier role in the whole process. Or so I like to think.
Want to come up here or speak right there?
How often does the FDA approve something or not approve something? So if a client hires you guys, would they normally approve it after you finish writing all the stuff, or is it a low probability?
So that's it's an interesting topic. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like, I don't know, 3% of drugs that start human trials that actually ever make it to FDA approval. Maybe it's 1%. It's a very low hit rate of all of the different products that a company is developing and trying out that will actually get approved. Now, when it comes to my company's involvement, we get involved at all different stages. So sometimes we're involved at the very earliest stage. So I think I mentioned those investigational new drug applications. So that would be like a company has done their bench work, their in vitro work, and then maybe they've done some rodent trials and some rabbit or monkey trials. And now they're ready to move into humans for their just very earliest trials to make sure the drug is at least safe in humans before we start looking at whether it's effective. So sometimes we're involved at that very early stage before they've even done any clinical studies. Once they come to us after their big pivotal, what we call the phase 3 studies, and they're saying, we think we have good data and we want to submit a marketing application, I would say at that point, it's maybe 50-50. If the company, usually the company will have had a lot of interactions with the FDA along the way, and they'll know what the FDA will and will not accept. They'll know what the FDA is looking for in their particular product, and they'll know if they've met those benchmarks. So there's a pretty decent chance that if they're bothering to put in a marketing application, they'll get that approval, hopefully. Then again, there are companies who, feel like they have to go for it regardless. So maybe their data weren't that great and they didn't quite hit all the benchmarks that FDA set for them, but they want to submit anyway in the hopes that they can have some kind of negotiation about exactly what they're allowed to market the drug for. So yeah, it's from inception, from research and development, it's an extremely small percentage. But from the point that you've decided to put in a marketing application, it's probably a majority that will get approved.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Do you need any legal certifications to become a regulatory medical writer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, to become a regulatory medical writer, you do not need any sort of legal certification. You do need some kind of science background and hopefully some kind of writing background, even if it's not formal. What does come into play is there's something called the Regulatory Affairs Certification, which is not a requirement, but a lot of people choose to pursue it. So I actually have my Regulatory Affairs certification that I got when I was about 2 years in to my career as a medical writer. So that is basically you study all of the FDA regulations related to drugs, devices, and biologics. And there's a very extensive test about it. And if you get a good enough score on the test, you get the certification, and then you need to do kind of continuing education to keep that up. So yeah, there's not any kind of law school equivalent or some kind of requirement, but there are, expectations for certain positions that you'll have either extensive experience in the field or you'll have some kind of certification in regulatory affairs.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We have another question.
What do you think is the coolest thing that you've written about?
I've worked on a couple of nasal sprays that I think are really interesting technologies that kind of combine, that take drugs that would have been delivered in a different format and deliver it in a nasal spray that can have a greater effect. So that's been kind of cool and interesting. We did work on a COVID-19 vaccine, so that was very exciting at the time. What else? Yeah, I don't know. I worked on an epilepsy drug, wrote a bunch of documents about that. So that was pretty cool for me because it kind of went back to my neuroscience roots. So I enjoyed that. Yeah, one of the most interesting kind of situations I found myself in was we got hired by a company in 2017 when I started at Impact. One company hired us to work on a particular product to write their marketing application for it. We wrote their big pivotal clinical study report, then we wrote their marketing application. Did all that, got it done and dusted, great. Then another company hired us to write their pivotal clinical study report and their marketing application for their competitor product. It was basically the exact same product, like some small differences in exact formulation, but almost the exact same thing. They were going to be direct competitors on the market. So I went from writing it for one client to writing it for another client. And that was really interesting to see their different approaches and to hear how they talked about each other. And of course, we kept their confidentiality. We didn't share anything from one to the other, but, hearing them trying to kind of find out what they could, like what was public information about the other company. So that was an interesting situation, even if the products themselves weren't super fascinating.
Okay, I think that's it on the questions. Thank you so much for presenting today.
Sure. Thank you all. This was fun.
Thank you.